Hi, this is the introduction to biology. What is biology? Well, biology is the study of life. Simple, right? Until I ask you, what is life? What is your definition? Everybody knows if something is dead or alive, right? Or at least that's what you think. Scientists have been arguing, like, for instance, viruses. Are viruses alive or not? That's a very good question, and scientists have been arguing for a long time, because on the one hand, some will tell you, oh yes, they're alive. I mean, they move from one cell to another, they cause infection, they kill cells, they make you sick. Yes, they're alive. Others will tell you, no, they're not alive. They cannot reproduce. They need to use the cell they infect to reproduce, so they're not alive. But if you try to give a definition of life and you look at the diversity of life, it's very difficult, to be honest. I mean, I have an example in here of bacteria. You have some fungi, some plants, some animals. A definition that applies to all of them seems difficult. So what scientists came up with is a number of characteristics that all living things have in common. Okay? All living things have to have these characteristics, or else they're not living things. So all living things are organized, respond to stimuli, reproduce, have the capacity to adapt, grow and develop, have multiple regulatory mechanisms, are homeostatic, and acquire materials and energy. And we are going to go slowly through each one of these characteristics so you can understand them better. Organisms are very well organized. Okay, let's begin with the smallest basic unit of life, that's the cell. Keep in mind, this is not a comprehensive classification. You could still go into the molecules, the atoms, and all that, and go beyond organism. This is just an example of organization. So the basic unit of life is the cell. And you can have organisms that have only one cell, and we call them unicellular, or they can be made up of many cells, and we call them multicellular. So let me give you my favorite example. You have the cell that forms the cardiac muscle, the heart muscle, and we call it a cardiomyocyte. Cyte means cells, myo means muscle, cardio means heart. Okay. Now, similar cells come together to form a tissue. That's the next level of organization. So you get a bunch of cardiomyocytes, they come together and they form cardiac muscle. But muscle by itself is not enough. Different tissues that are trying to accomplish the same goal come together and they form the next level, that's the organ. So you have the cardiac muscle, but you add in there maybe epithelial tissue to cover the inside and outside of the heart, and we are going to add some nervous tissue, control, connective tissue because it holds everything together. You form an organ, that's the heart. But only one organ cannot do a whole lot by itself. So many organs come together to form an organ system. So you get your heart and you add blood vessels, you add blood, obviously, and now you have a system, the cardiovascular system. But you're not only a cardiovascular system, you have a digestive system, you have a nervous system, you have an endocrine system. So all of the systems together form an organism. In this particular case, you add all of their systems, and there you are. Okay? Organisms respond to stimuli. And the first question is, what is a stimulus? Any change in the environment or anything that provokes a response is considered a stimulus. And they're internal and external. In this chapter, we're only talking about external stimuli that cause the organism to move either towards the stimulus or away from it. Okay? So obviously different organisms are going to use different mechanisms. The movement of the organism is going to be a large part of its behavior. The important thing is that this behavior is directed towards avoiding injury, acquiring food, or mating. Let's say that you just step down the sidewalk and you hear a car blowing the horn. You don't want to get run over, right? So you jump right back into the sidewalk. You responded moving away from the stimulus. This Venus flytrap. A fly just landed in there. You cannot see it in this picture, but it has a number of hairs. When the fly moving randomly touches one of those hairs, that's the stimulus, because it's a trap to close. Now the fly's caught in there, and the plant acquires food. And main think, for instance, on the display of a tom turkey opening the tail, and the female turkey goes running to it. So organisms move towards or away, and these are the basic functions: avoiding injury, acquiring food, mating. Organisms have to reproduce, okay, and develop. Nobody lives forever, so you're going to have to make other organisms like yourself. Now, how it happens depends on the type of organisms. Very simple organisms, either bacteria or in general single-cell organisms, they just divide in two. Now, some are a little bit more complex than others, and there's different mechanisms, but the basic idea is they just split in two. Multicellular organisms with, this is a very generic thing. In the second semester, you see more about that, but in general, you have the union of an egg and a sperm that produces an embryo, because we're talking about sexual reproduction, but like I said, different types of reproduction will come in the next semester, and that embryo has to grow. How does the embryo grow into what it's supposed to be? Because the information is stored in the genes that are inherited from the parents. And you're going to hear a lot about genes in biology, okay? So for today, just keep in mind genes are made of DNA. Organisms have the capacity to adapt. I'm not talking about just global warming. If you look at the life of the Earth, the conditions have changed tremendously. I mean, there were glaciations when the ice covered a large part of the surface of the Earth. There were warm periods in between. Scientists have actually discovered tropical plants buried under the ice in Antarctica. So at a certain time, Antarctica was tropical, hard as it is to imagine. So the environment is constantly changing. And some species are better adapted than others, or some organisms are better adapted to a particular environment at a particular time. So the features that make that organism better suited to the environment are called adaptations. Now, individuals that are better adapted, they're more likely to survive, and they're more likely to reproduce, so there's going to be more like it. This differential reproductive success, that's what we call natural selection. And it seems to change the characteristics of population over time. But I like to always warn a student, most of the time, yes, sometimes there's mutations involved, but most of the time, all you're changing, like as I put here for evolution, is the frequency of traits. My favorite example is that moth in England. It can be light color, almost white, or it can be very dark gray. Before the Industrial Revolution, the tree trunks in England had lichen, so they were very light color. So the dark moths stuck like a sore thumb, they were very easy to be seen by the birds and got eaten. So that means before the Industrial Revolution, there was more light color moths. Then the Industrial Revolution came, there was no rules about pollution, the tree trunks turned black. Now it was easier to eat the white moths. So the ratio changed from mostly white moths to mostly dark moths. Then they passed rules regulating pollution, the tree trunks turned white again, and now once again, we have more light color modes than dark color. But what I want you to understand is that there's been always light color and dark color. All that changed was the frequency. Can you have mutations? Yes. And we will talk about evolution. You have 1 or 2 chapters, okay? But in general, the most common thing that happens is that the frequency of the traits vary. This is my favorite example of adaptation. Polar bears. You have to love them. Think about where does the polar bear live? Well, the polar bear lives in the North Pole, right? So it's ice, it's snow, it's cold, and they hunt seals that are usually seen on the ice right next to the water. So whenever they see a bear coming, they're going to jump right back into the water. First thing, the polar bear needs to stay warm. So it has a special fat, brown fat. It's different from the regular fat. Regular fat stores energy that the body can use for many different things. But brown fat has a little disconnect in the Krebs cycle. It produces mostly heat. So it allows the bear to stay warm under those conditions. In addition, you have very thick fur, you have a layer of fat that insulates the bear, keeps that heat that the brown fat is producing inside of the bear. The fur is white. Why? Because we just said if the seals see the polar bear coming, they're going to jump in the water, and they're gone. A white bear blends with the ice and snow in the environment, and it's difficult to see. And it's amazing, but polar bears have been observed to rub snow on their noses, so the nose turns white too, and they're harder to see. If you don't think that's amazing, polar bears have a genetic mutation in their fat metabolism, because we just said they eat seals. The seals are mostly blubber. I mean, they're swimming in ice cold water, okay? So they have a lot of fat. That means the polar bear has an awful diet. Most of his diet is fat. If a human being has a mostly fat diet, he'll get high cholesterol, a cardiovascular disease, doesn't last very long. But the polar bear has a mutation that controls the fat metabolism. It does not get high cholesterol, it does not get cardiovascular disease. They're perfectly adapted to the environment in which they live. We say organisms have to grow and develop. Growth can refer to size sometimes, the size of cells, muscle cells grow with size if you're doing weightlifting, but usually we're talking about an increase in the number of cells. I like to tell people when you began, use 1 cell, right? The egg has been fertilized, so the zygote is just 1 cell. Depending on your size, right now you're going to be anywhere probably between 30 and 40 trillion cells. So the number of cells has increased. You grow by making more and more and more cells. But you're not a blob of cells. Look in the mirror. Look at this unborn baby. You can see perfectly well the eye and the nose, and I can see the heart in here, and that big spot in there is the liver. You can see the hand and the feet. So the changes that take place between conception and death, we call them development. And basically what it is once the cells are determined what they're going to be, they start producing the proteins that they need for their function. They start many times changing shape, size, so they become completely different cells. So imagine you are a red blood cell. Well, you want to have a disc shape because your function is to transport gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide. The disc shape happens to offer more surface. So you have more gaseous exchange, and you make hemoglobin because this is the protein that carries oxygen. But if it's still a red blood cell, you was maybe a gastric cell in the stomach. You don't need any particular shape. If anything, we're not going to get into all of that. There's a particular shape. You have You're going to be columnar and have macrovilli because that's what allows you to secrete a whole lot of what you're making. And you don't make hemoglobin because you don't carry oxygen. What do? You're going to make the acid that you use to digest the food. So you're going to be making hydrochloric acid. So a red blood cell doesn't look like a gastric cell in shape, contains different chemicals. They're completely different cells. That's what development means. Okay? Organisms have multiple regulatory mechanisms in order to coordinate internal functions. A very good example is the heart. Okay. When you do the second semester, you learn how the heart beats and all of that. But what is amazing about the heart is not just that it's beating, but that it changes the speed, the rate of beating, depending on the conditions. Maybe you're going to run a marathon. Well, if you're going to run a marathon, believe me, you're going to need, or your legs are going to need a lot of energy. Where do you get energy from? From cellular respiration. That means you need oxygen. So the heart starts being faster to send more oxygen to your leg muscles so they can get the energy that they need to run the whole marathon. The sympathetic nervous system speeds up your heart. Now it's nighttime, okay? And especially if you run a marathon earlier in the day, you're tired. And you're finished with everything and you're sitting watching TV. And what is the only exercise you're doing? Well, maybe with your thumb, you're working the remote surfing channels. That doesn't take a lot of energy, does it? So you don't need a lot of oxygen. The heart is going to slow down. You have the parasympathetic nervous system that slows down your heart. So by having two different regulatory mechanisms in the heart beats at exactly the right rate for whatever your activity is. Instead of you having to adapt to do whatever the heart allows you to, the heart adapts to whatever you want to do. Also, organisms are homeostatic. Homeostasis means staying the same. Basically, organisms need to keep the internal environment more or less constant. That's the key word there, relatively constant. It's like a thermostat. You set the thermostat at a certain temperature, and when the temperature reaches that number, your air conditioner comes on. But when the temperature goes down a little bit, the air conditioner stops. You have a little variation in there. If you have a thermometer that reads tenths of a degree, you realize that there is variation between the temperature at which the air comes on and the temperature at which the air stops. Same thing with your internal environment. You have a very narrow range and you try to keep a temperature, level of water, acidity within that narrow environment. I have an example here of the human body temperature. You cannot see the numbers, but we are talking about 1 degree difference between the lowest number, that's usually early in the morning, and the highest, that's in the evening. If the temperature goes above that highest limit, you have a fever. There's a reason for that, but that's not normal. If the temperature goes below that, you're suffering from hypothermia. But your normal body temperature ranges within a 1 degree variation during the day. Finally, organisms need to acquire material and energy. I mean, you need energy because there's a capacity to do work. Okay? And you need materials to grow, to replace cells and organelles that are worn out, to make whatever the cells are making. To do all of life's activities, you're going to need materials. So basically, the energy comes from the sun. That's the primary source of energy on Earth. Now, plants, and we call those organisms producers, can take the sun energy, they can take carbon dioxide from the air, and they produce glucose. Now, that glucose can be used to make other molecules that can be stored whatever. Plants will also take some chemicals from the soil. Now, some animals are going to eat the plants. We call them consumers. They cannot make their own food like the plants did. They have to eat the food that somebody else made. That's what I call consumers. Other animals are going to eat animals. They don't eat plants. Okay? They're still consumers. Notice that every time we change from one type of organism to another, there's always a little bit of loss of energy as heat. Plants, producers, consumers, anything eventually dies. So we have another set of organisms, decomposers, that break down the nutrients that were in your body, return it to the soil, and release heat too. We're not going to get now into the cycles, but every organism, you can tell that they're getting energy and they're getting materials from the sun or from other organisms. We said that there's a tremendous variation in life. So living organisms are assigned to groups based upon the similarities, and taxonomy is the science that identifies and groups organisms and assigns a name to each species that we call a binomial. Called binomial because that means two names. You get the genus and the species. The genus is always capitalized, and both of them are usually written in italics, although when you're handwriting, you don't do that. So here you have some examples. Okay, human, Homo sapiens, that's the sweet pea, that's cat. What do we need scientific names? Well, let me give you an example. When I was a graduate student, I got an apartment by myself, and since I didn't have roommates, I was able to get me a hatul. What did I have? You didn't hear it? It's a hatul. Let me see, because I'm not very good. I haven't been studying lately. Oh, sorry. Yeah. There, hatul. That's what I had. You still don't know what it is? You don't speak Hebrew? Okay, let me try again. When I was a graduate student, I got me a gato. Some of you are saying, I know what you had. You had a cat. You're right, I had a cat. But even that, well, common sense tells you it was a kitty cat. But when people talk about cats, it could be kitty cat, it could be mountain lion. Cat is not very specific. So, because of the difference in languages, because common names are not specific, scientists use binomials. I can go anywhere in the world, and if I tell a scientist that I had a Felis domesticus, they know exactly that I had a kitty cat. Okay? So you see the importance of the binomial. Now we are going to classify organisms. The largest is domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Yes, you have to memorize them. Yes, you need to know them in order, because the biggest one is the most inclusive. We are going to see. And then as you start putting conditions, it's becoming less and less inclusive and more specific. Now, I told you I don't like memory. So there's a little mnemonic I like. Dear King Philip came over for good soup. Silly, but you can see the domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. I don't understand that about the human brain, but someone did a study and they concluded that the human brain remembers nonsense better than sense. This is a very, very good example of that. So we're going to talk a little bit about domains. We're not going to cover all of them in detail, okay, I promise. We're almost finished. But domains is the largest classification. There's actually 3 domains, and every organism is going to be part of one. They've been classified by biochemical and genetic evidence. Some of them are very obvious, you can classify them. Some, like I said, it takes some research to figure it out. But you have the domain archaea. These are supposed to be the oldest organisms. They're very different from everybody else. The most important thing about archaea, in my opinion, is that they can live under extreme conditions. Places where you not imagine anything could live, you find archaea. What do I mean? Well, think about geothermic vents in the bottom of the ocean. It's boiling water, but there's archaea living in there. Think on the Dead Sea. Think the amount of salt. Why is it called dead? Because for centuries we thought nothing living there. Oh, there's archaea living in there. Okay? So they can live under extreme conditions. You have bacteria. We'll talk more about bacteria. By the way, both archaea and bacteria are considered, we're not going to get to that right now, but the prokaryotes, there's no harm. Because they don't have a membrane surrounding the nucleus. There's not an organelle that you can call a nucleus. Eukarya, on the other hand, are eukaryotes that do have, okay, prokaryotes, eukarya, it makes sense that they are eukaryotes, meaning that they do have a nucleus with a nuclear membrane. But they can be a bunch of different things, and we're going to look at the next level, the kingdom. Okay. These are just some examples. You have some bacteria in here, the part of the main bacteria. This is hot spring, and these color things are actually some archaea living in there. They're called extremophiles because they like extreme temperatures. They like hot water. And you have two examples of eukarya. You have plants, you have animals in there. When you get to the kingdoms, we are going to see that there is 4 different kingdoms in eukarya. Remember, there was 3 domains, but the domain eukarya is divided into 4 kingdoms. So you have protist or protista, fungi, plantae, and animalia. Some are very easy. This is only 3 animals, plants, fungus, mushrooms, yeast, mold, all of that. Protista, this is the hardest one because some people say there's so many variations that the really should be considered like many different kingdoms. But most biology textbooks say any eukarya that does not belong to the fungi, plantae, or animalia, you throw it in there. That everything that does not belong to any of their kingdoms goes into protist because of the tremendous variations. And you're going to go through this in the second semester, so don't worry about it. This is just try to show you a little bit the difference between the different kingdoms. Basically, protists tend to be usually single cell. It's very rare to have more than one cell, and when you do have more than one cell, it's more like a colony, not like forming multicellular organism. Fungi, they can be one cell or many cells. A yeast is only one cell. A mushroom is made up of many cells. Plants are usually multicellular, and animals multicellular. We are not going to worry right now about any of this. I'm just trying to show you the difference between the different groups. The major difference is where do they get the food from. Okay? Protists are very small. So most of the time they're going to be absorbing the food. They don't chew anything, they don't catch. A few of them can do photosynthesis. A very few are able to swallow some things whole. But most of them, they just absorb the food through their work. Fungi, same thing, absorb the food through the roots, yes, but they don't do photosynthesis. Have you ever seen a green mushroom? I mean, if you ever find a green mushroom in the store, don't buy it. They're not supposed to be green, okay? Plants, they do photosynthesis. That's the way they get nutrients. And animals are going to ingest the food. They're going to eat plants, or they're going to eat another animal, and especially in the second semester of biology, you will study the development of the digestive system in animals. But at least this gives you an idea of the difference between the different kingdoms. So I know this one wasn't difficult, but if you want to work with me on a one-on-one basis, in biology I don't have so many practice problems. I will when we get to genetics, I promise. But I do have some worksheets that will allow you to put things together to get an overall picture of a particular chapter, to make easier to memorize and all of that. If you need help preparing for an exam, you can find the link to my Washington Turing profile in the video description. Make an appointment and I'll be glad to help you.